everybody. Welcome once again to Pieros and Fools. You're listening to Mark Cocking on Critical Mass Radio. We're going to talk tonight about money. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding. That's no surprise to me. I don't have a claim to know it all, but I have spent a life pondering it and in that career. But there is a lot out there that is misinformation and disinformation, and we all need to wake up to the fact that we are living in a pre-war period. This is serious stuff going down, and it doesn't take someone like me to tell you what sort of things go on in these times. So that's why, in an esoteric way, I'll keep hitting back to the point, which I believe is, the way to trigger all the solutions, and something that we're going to have to do anyway. I also said I'd touch on the 2732, this number stuff that I keep going into, because it is relevant depending upon, the kind of esoteric depths you want to take your own studies or investigations into this. That is obviously derived, as I've spoken many times, from 1/366, and 366 is the natural number by which you would divide the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. The Earth spins 366 times in one orbit. So there's a natural resonance there. That number, I've pointed out, keeps cropping up in so many ways. Get your pencil ready if you're interested in this. I have pointed out many ways that no one else is. Peter Plichter has. I've gone over and beyond that and pointed out other ways in which this number is most relevant if you're into sacred geometry, or the study of what is this reality anyway. From the perspective that those who do control us obviously have a better insight into this reality than we, the commoners, do, it's pretty damn handy to understand it, I think, because what was made clear to me is that they don't either, that they work with what they've got. Anyway, 2732. If it were important, it is the tangent of the slope angle of the pyramid, as I pointed out a few weeks ago. But if it were important and all those other strange coincidences where it crops up, you would expect it to have some relevance in its own right. Well, it does. It is the square of 2 pi over pi cubed. That's the square of 2 pi over pi cubed. So if your initial response is, well, right, so what? You have a defined natural geometric number there. I'm going to just read to you little sections from Trevelyan's English Social History, talking about the 14th century, getting into money. It says, 2 miles from London lay Westminster, clustering round its abbey and its hall, which Rufus had built and which Richard II was adorning with rafters of oak. Westminster had become the recognised centre of royal administration, law and parliament, although it had no commerce and no municipal privileges of its own, and was only a village at Great London's gates. There was no royal foothold inside the English capital, corresponding to the Louvre in Paris. When the king came up to town, he lived sometimes at Westminster on one side of London, and sometimes in the Tower on the other. But the city that lay between was not his ground, and Richard II was no more able than Charles I to dictate to its militia, its magistrates, and its mob. The medieval balance and harmony of powers from which modern English liberty has sprung, questionably, is clearly illustrated in the relation of the Plantagenet kings to their capital. The richest citizens of London were now on a par with the great territorial nobles, not only because they had at their command the city militia and a large proportion of the shipping in England, but because they lent the money to government. In 1290, Edward I had expelled the Jews from England, so putting an end to the older method of raising royal loans. This expulsion of the Jews is one cause why anti-Semitism is today, arguably again, but it says here, less strong in England than in many countries of Europe. I do believe this was written in 1927-ish. Our forefathers were compelled by the action of Edward I to undertake their own financial and intellectual life unaided by Jewry. So that when in Cromwell's time the Jews were allowed to return, the English had learned to stand alone and could meet without jealousy that gifted race on equal terms. And so, in the absence of the Jews, Edward III borrowed money for his wars from the Florentine bankers, talked about them much in previous shows, who also supplied the needs of his barons. In the second day of Boccaccio's Decameron, we read how 3 Florentines, coming to London, took a little house and lived as frugally as possible, letting out money on interest. When they had made enough money, they returned to Florence, but keeping on their banking trade in England, they sent a nephew thither named Alessandro to manage their business. He let out money to the barons upon their castles and other estates, which turned to good account. But the king also borrowed from his subjects, the great city men, as we may already call them, and from the wealthy merchants of other towns like Sir William de la Pole of Hull, the first English businessman to become the founder of a great noble house. The relation of the crown to these new creditors was very different from its previous relation to the Jews, who had been mere sponges in the king's hand to suck up his subjects' wealth, helpless clients whom he alone protected from the popular malice and massacre. But the English merchants, who lent money to government for the 100 Years' War, could give or withhold their aid as they chose, and they took advantage of the need that the king had of them to bargain for commercial or other advantages, for themselves or for their families, for their city, their craft, and their trade. Now there's a note with at the end of that chapter. It says, with reference to the fact that when the Jews were allowed to return in Cromwell's time, it says the expulsion of the Jews had been preceded by a decline in their wealth and power of lending. Otherwise, they would not have been expelled. English and foreign Christians had already been taking their place as moneylenders to the king and to his subjects. Industry and agriculture were changing and expanding all through the late Middle Ages and required the borrowing of capital by king, lord of manor, farmer, villein, and trader. The laws against usury prohibited interest instead of limiting it. The result was that very high interest, often 50%, was asked and given, as the transaction was illegal in the first place. That's a point worth considering if you're trying to delve into the history of finance. It says later on in this history, through the Stuart era, there was eager and angry competition, economic and political, for a share in the profits of the Indian trade, all the more because there was no easy common way of finding investment for money, though savings were rapidly accumulating. There was no regular stock market where a man could make his choice among a number of reasonably hopeful ventures. The usual way of investing money was to purchase land or mortgages on land. Nothing changes, But the amount of land was limited, and it was, moreover, an article which owners were, for reasons other than economic, exceedingly unwilling to sell. The social and the sporting value of landed estate made it hard to buy, and so the question, what to do with one's money other than keep it in a strong box at home, puzzled many people, from the nobleman to the thrifty yeoman and the artisan. 4/5 of the population was tilling the land, but a gradually increasing proportion were engaged in a trade or industry, more often in the country than in the town. It was a day of small businesses rapidly increasing in number. A yeoman or craftsman who had saved a little money could not in those days use it to buy consoles or railway or brewery shares. He might spend some of it in a marriage portion to provide his daughter with a husband as an establishment for life. For the rest, he would very likely invest his savings in a new venture of his own, employing apprentices and journeymen to set up an industry or a shop, or perhaps buying horses, carts and pack saddles to serve the neighbourhood as a carrier. The number of such small employers and tradesmen was on the increase, and they, like the East India Company, often wanted to borrow money for their business. So, too, did landowners, not only the squire in distress due to extravagance, but the squire prudently eager to drain, clear and improve his land. and increase the agricultural acreage at the expense of wood and waste. So how did this various classes of adventurers borrow money for their enterprises? How were they put in touch with persons willing to lend and to invest? Well, society had at last, in the course of the Tudor reigns, abandoned the medieval doctrine that it was wrong to lend money on interest. Lending money on reasonable terms had now been made legal by Act of Parliament, and therefore interest was less exorbitant. Thinkers who led opinion under the early Stuarts clearly saw the use of a money market. "'Tis a vain thing," Selden told his friends, "to say money begets not money, for that no doubt it does." And the very practical mercantile philosopher Thomas Munn wrote, "How many merchants and shopkeepers have begun with little or nothing of their own, and yet are grown very rich by trading with other men's money." There were no banks in England at the time, but there were persons who performed some of the functions of modern bankers, receiving deposits and lending out money on interest. Brokers and scriveners, in the way of their ordinary business, had special opportunities to oblige clients by arranging such operations or by bringing borrower and lender together. During the Commonwealth and after the Restoration, the holdings and lending of money passed more and more into the hands of the goldsmiths of London. The merchants of the city had been accustomed to keep their spare cash in the Tower Mint, but after Charles I had seized it, they preferred to trust the goldsmiths. As the outbreak of civil strife, when the wealthy of both sides melted their plate into pikes and musketeers, the goldsmiths' ordinary occupation of selling gold and silver vessels was suspended during the years of war, and they were glad instead to become the merchants' cash keepers, to receive and pay for nothing, few observing or conjecturing the profit they had for their pains. So massive indeed was the profit that the goldsmiths soon found it worthwhile to encourage deposits by paying interest, and under Charles II they gave 6%, for they employed the deposits to great advantage in lending to others. The principal goldsmiths thus engaged were those in Lombard Street. The goldsmiths' business as proto-bankers was by no means confined to dealings with city merchants. Many landowners had their rents paid into goldsmiths' hands, and while others all over the country came to Lombard Street for loans. The value of these new conveniences can be illustrated by examining the actual method by which a certain noble family managed its extensive affairs in the reign of Charles I. But I won't. It's just an example, and it's rather boring in terms of the amount of money exchanged. So there's a kind of, well, it's not even a history, it's just an insight into two earlier periods in history.